Howdy, y'all. Today we're doing a tier listing of Seraphon units. Let's jump in. I've got it divided into 4 different tiers, and this is obviously my own personal opinion. So please let me know in the comments below where I've gotten it wrong, which units you favor more, or maybe which ones I've got ranked too high. All right, let's look at tier 4. This is what I'm calling our narrative units. So in this one, we've got Kixi Taka. This is that war band that we have for Seraphon. And I would say that this is not a competitive choice. This is why we've got it in the narrative units. Ones you might play if you're having fun, but probably not a competitive choice. This is, honestly, there's no real reason to take this warband other than you just like the models. Take a unit of Chameleon Skinks and a Skink Priest instead. You'll get more utility out of it. Next up, tier 4, we've got a Ripperdactyl Chief and the Ripperdactyl Riders. Now, these guys have some terrible output damage now in this new edition. There's no rend. You do get some rerolls once with them via the Bloat Toad, but really, they don't really hold a role anymore. These things used to be awesome at the beginning of AOS 2.0. I used to love Ripperdactyls, but in the newest edition, with their new War Scroll, they're just not going to see the table much. They are very cheap. You can use them as screens, but I think we've got better options. Next up, we've got basically all of the Saurus foot heroes. The Eternity Warden, the Old Blood, the Scarvet on Cold One, which I'm gonna kind of consider him a hero on foot for this purpose. Saurus Sunblood. All of these have command abilities that really need updating into AOS 3.0. They have command abilities that either conflict with other ones that we're going to be using, like all out attack, or they're just a straight up overlay that +1 to hit, and so they're just not useful. Other things, the Sunblood is nice, but it's really, it's buffing things that are very close, and it's pretty slow. It just really doesn't hold a point competitively in our lists, especially when Saurus is kind of on the weaker end of Seraphon anyway. They can have uses, and I think with some tweaks, they could be better, and they could bump up a tier. But as it is right now, I think they're in our lowest tier. Speaking of which, Saurus, we've also got a Saurus Warriors. They're not really a great anvil. You can pour a ton of buffs into them, not a ton. You can pour some buffs into them to make them a better anvil, but they're still not a great anvil. They're not really a great hammer. Their damage output isn't all that good. We've got a lot better damage from other things, and you just have to put too many things into them to make them work. Also, just not a great battle line. We have other battle line options. Coherency hit them hard. Just their War Scroll, to be honest, isn't really up to date. It's about the same, kind of like the model, not really up to date. You'll see them mostly via summons from the Engine of the Gods. Not really played a whole lot because of some of those issues. Another tier 4 unit is the Razordon Hunting Pack. The attacks are very random, and they don't have any rend until you get within 6 inches. And the counterattack damage got nerfed from the previous edition. These Razordons used to be a terror of the previous edition, kind of like the Ripperdactyl Riders. Ripperdactyls and Razordons were kind of paired up in some of these nightmare lists that we had that were doing very good. But in this edition, they're not up to snuff. Too much random, and not enough hard hitting damage there. Last one for tier 4 is the Bastildon with Arc of Sotek. This is a cheap monster, and it still can tank quite a bit with that 1-up save, which is very nice. But its damage output is just very poor. It's got this weird rule where you're rolling 18 dice, and on 6s it does a mortal wound. And it does have a hit profile for it, but the hit and wounds profile is absolutely terrible with no rend, 1 damage. And so really you're doing 3 mortals a turn, and that's really about it. And so even though it's 165 points, you might fit it into a list every once in a while, but it's not really a highly competitive choice with its current War Scroll. On to tier 3, so we're moving up a tier, and I think these are solid units. These are all models that can be used in your army, and I think they have a role to play in the army, but they're not going to be overpowered. Nobody's ever going to look at these things and say, that shouldn't be in the list. This is too powerful. It needs a nerf, please. They have a role, but you could do a list without them. So the first one is Saurus Astrolith Bear. It's a pure support hero, and it's kind of it's some of its rules are getting a little outdated now, in that it does have a ward save aura that we kind of get in um, Coalesced via any terrain. So that one's kind of duplicated. It's got a +1 to its spell for wizards, but we have other ways to get that too. This can stack on top of that. That helps, but it's not necessary. Its unique role is that it does boost that spell range for wizards, which is a fantastic ability. And that's really the only reason you're taking this, is for that. You're taking 150 points to get that extra spell range. In Starborn, you're taking it to get some extra summons. It's just a pure support hero. And so it does have that role. It's a solid unit, not a must-have. Next one is Saurus Old Blood on Carnosaur. Now, this one's a little bit more expensive than the other Carnosaur at 55 more points than the Scarvet. And it basically does about the same amount of damage. It does have a small shooting attack, not worth 55 points for that shooting attack. And its command ability is pretty much useless. It's a +1 to hit, which we can get a bunch of other ways. And so it really doesn't have a clear role as a hero. It can do some damage, but I can get a cheaper one for 55 less points in the Scar Veteran. And I'm usually taking the Scar Veteran on Carnosaur. Skink Oracle on Troglodon is another tier 3 unit. A solid pick if you're looking to support Croak. This will let Croak put his spells that are pretty short range out wherever your Troglodon is across the board. It's expensive at 270 points, and that you're adding that cost on to what Croak's already expensive cost is. But it does have a somewhat of a role there. If it got lower in points, I think it's going to start climbing that tier. But as it is now, it's staying at tier 3. The monster, the Troglodon, almost does 0 damage. I mean, it's very poor damage output with some no rend attacks and then -1 rend attack. Really just not as fearsome of a war scroll as the model looks. Pterodon Chief and Pterodon Riders, I think, fit into tier 3. They have a role, and I think you can still play them. They're not as scary as they used to be. They are very fragile. And they do have some mortal wound output, which our army is lacking in its units. We have some abilities that do that, but we really only have a couple units that give us mortal wounds, and Pterodons are one of them. But you got to get them there. They are very fast, and so they can make it across the board. But in today's meta, they're just not quite doing enough damage that you want to see, especially because their mortals are once per game. And they're really dependent on that extra Pterodon Chief to give it a better chance of rolling the mortal wounds. Next up, we've got the Saurus Guard. I love these models. The Saurus Guard models are my favorite Saurus models, I think. They're a lot of fun to put together. They're a lot of fun to paint. It's a great model. Unfortunately, they're not quite as good on the table. You're gonna only take them as a support piece for Aslan or Croak. They can take those wounds that Aslan or Croak would take, but really these guys need some more damage in melee. 115 points for bodyguards. I think that's on par with some of the other bodyguards that you see in the game right now. I would like to see these guys though do a little bit more damage in melee. They look fearsome. They've got a giant poleaxe. Let's get some more damage in melee for these guys, and I think we could bump them up a tier. Chameleon Skinks, they have a great utility role in that ambush, and they can deploy off the board and come in outside of 9 inches of any enemy model, and they have a great utility there in that ambush, but they're really not a damage dealer. You're not going to see the Chameleon Skinks doing a lot of damage. In the previous edition, before the reinforcement rules, you could take a whole lot of these in one unit, and you could actually do quite a bit of damage. Now you're basically running these in units of 5, maybe 10 if you're crazy, but they're not really going to do a lot of damage. They're really there about board control. In that role, they do well. They're only 115 points, but they don't really excel at that all that well. Kroxigor, these Kroxigor are fun. They're heavy elite models. They're still cheap though, so they're cheap for these elite type models. They're not very fast. Not a whole lot of buffs you can give them, but when they get into combat, they can do some pretty good damage, especially if you get them into hordes. If we start seeing the horde meta come back, then we might see Kroxigor fulfilling a role more and more often. This is one that I think we could see fluctuate on tier levels if we could get some keywords to where we could buff them. And depending on how the meta turns out, we might see Kroxigor perform better. And the Dread Saurian. Put the Dread Saurian in tier 3. It would have been bumped up to tier 2 if it could have still had the totem keyword, but they took that away from us. And so now the Dread Saurian can't give itself command abilities and command points anymore, which is a shame. But this thing has a huge base. It's an absolute unit of a model, and that in of itself could bump it up a tier. But it's a ton of wounds. It's hard to kill, but it's also very hard to play with a base that is enormous. It doesn't fly natively on its war scroll, so you're moving this thing around the terrain on the board. It becomes very difficult. And to be honest, there's enough damage output in the game now that they can remove this Dread Saurian in one turn. You see that with Mega Gargants, how they get removed in one turn. If you put this in Coalesced, I think it can play better because it's doing even more damage reduction. But a tough model to play with, but looks awesome on the board. Tier 2, we got Tier 2. I consider Tier 2 to be our strong units. I think these are the ones that you're going to see in a lot of lists. It's not auto-include, but I think you'll see them in a lot in lists based on either their points or their abilities and the things that they do for Seraphon on the table. First one up is Lord Croak. Great model, our newest model here, and it shows us that when GW gives us a new model, they really go over and above. This Lord Croak model is incredible, and the War Scroll's pretty interesting. He's an awesome support hero. Absolutely controls the magic phase on both your turn and the opponent's turn. And when Croak gets into close range, it can do a ton of damage. But to really let Lord Croak shine, it requires a lot of heavy support. And I think that's what keeps it out of tier 1, is that for Croak to really shine, you're taking a couple hundred points of support. The Astrolith Banner Bearer, Guard, maybe definitely like a Skink Priest, a Skink Star Priest, or maybe even the Troglodyte if you're going just full into Croak. But he really requires some extra support to really get all your money's worth out of that 430 points. Next up, we got the Saurus Scar Veteran on Carnosaur. This is a very cheap monster. At 215 points, that is an incredibly cheap monster hero. And monster heroes are very useful in this edition. There's lots you can do with them, from scoring very specific battle plans that you need heroes to score. They can do well there. But that -1 rend on the Carnosaur's jaw just really hurts when it comes down to all the save stacking in Age of Sigmar right now. I think that's what keeps it out of a higher tier. It's probably also what keeps its points down. So you've got to kind of balance that. Do we want more rend? If we do, the points are probably going to go up. The Scarvet on Carnosaur can be very swingy damage. Sometimes you'll hit and get those jaw attacks that do 5 damage each to hit, and it'll feel awesome. But then sometimes that -1 rend, the poor hit rolls on 4s to hit, will just whiff, and it'll do nothing. So very swingy damage. And I think, as I said, as this War Scroll is updated to the newest edition, I think you'll see it increase in points as its command ability and rend all become more useful. We've also got Skink Starseer in tier 2. This is one you don't see a lot, but is a very strong model. It has a spell that can do +1 to save for you or -1 to save for the enemy. And that is very strong in this edition because there's lots of ways to buff saves in this edition. And if you can debuff the opponent's saves, that helps counteract all of Seraphon's low rend. And so now all those things that we're shooting and attacking with -1 rend, this will help us get that extra pip of rend that we need versus that target. Also, the 3d6 charge ability, where you can say a unit within certain range of this Starseer can charge 3d6, is very good for making those long charges, especially since a lot of our things we want in melee are pretty slow. And so that is a very good ability. The biggest downside of the Star Seer is that it's slow and very weak. This support hero will get shot off the board pretty easy, and so keep that in mind as you fit that into your army. I've also got Saurus Knights on my tier 2 strong units. It's a great MSU screen. It does roll lots of dice, and it takes buffs fairly well. There's different units you can buff this with. The Star Priest, you can buff it with the generic command abilities. It takes pretty well. And if you have any Carnosaurs, it's a decent target for that if you're using your generic command abilities on other things. But no rend. That's one of the things that hurts it, is that they have no rend. Only 110 points, so it's not bad for a screen, especially in Coalesced where you're looking for a couple screens for all your big monsters. Knights play very well into that. 10 wounds, 4-up save, -1 damage, and you can easily get some extra buffs on them to give them a better save. So not a bad unit, and takes up a lot of real estate. That's why I've got them on there. It takes up a lot of real estate, roll a lot of dice. I like that. Skinks are definitely one of our strong units. It's the ultimate Swiss Army knife unit, in that you can outfit them in a lot of different ways to either be melee heavy, shooting heavy, or a mixture of both. And so it depends on your playstyle, depends on how you might kit them out, and you can play to those strengths to play well with Skinks. They can fit just about any role. You need a good shooting unit. They do that well. You need some mortals, pair them up with a Star Priest, and you get some mortal wound output. Fast objective holders, they can do that. Screens, Skinks can do that. A very, very versatile unit in our army. You'll see them in both MSU, like minimum strength units of 10, or maxed out with all your reinforcement points at 30. You'll see them taken all those different ways, and they can absorb a lot of buffs. They have the skink keyword. Obviously, it's a bunch of skinks, and so they take a lot of those buffs that we have available in our army, and they play well, honestly, in any of the sub-factions. Maybe not Quaddle's Claw, but any of the other sub-factions they play well in. Coalesce, Thunder Lizard, Fangs, Draco's Tail, they all play well in those lists. Tier 2, this is one I might bump to tier 1. I love Stegodons. But I don't think they're tier 1 at the moment, but tier 2, strong unit, Stegodons as a battle line in Thunder Lizards is a lot of fun, and it's a good unit. It has a mixture of abilities in that it's a monster that can shoot and it can fight well. And so that's kind of a rare combination there. A lot of monsters will specialize in one or the other. This one will let you get some of those battle tactics well with monsters, because you're shooting with them and you're charging with them to do melee. Plus their battle line and their monsters. So that has a lot of versatility in GHB 21, in that we have different roles that these Stegodons can play in that kind of multi-role fighter. It definitely benefits from Gur. We'll see how the next season of Age of Sigmar, what it does for monsters. But right now, as Battle Line and Thunder Lizards, it's kind of fitted in the other list. But I think you'll see them mostly in Battle Line and Thunder Lizards. They do very well. They also take the skink buffs from all those little support heroes, because there are skinks on this Stegodon, so they get all those buffs that really help them out as well. Tier 1. My tier 1 units I'm adding for Seraphon are those units that are our top performers. I think you're going to see these in most lists. You'll see these pop up in those competitive lists. If you're really looking to fine-tune your list, you're probably going to include a couple of these, maybe all of these, but at least one or two of these in your list to really fine-tune these buffs and things. The first one is the Engine of Gods. It's just a great piece in that it's a hero. It gets a weird artillery rule, so that fits us well into a lot of different battalions, especially the battle regiment, where you can get an extra monster hero in that 1-drop battle regiment by using its artillery keyword. It's a utility hero that can fight well. It does have a lot of different things it does, but one of those it does well is fight. It can do quite a bit of damage, especially when you're layering on the different buffs that we have available for it. You can really get some great output out of the Engine of the Gods. It's also a priest with it doesn't have any Seraphon prayers, which means we can grab a prayer from the generic prayer lore for the GHB. And there's some great ones in there. most notably Curse. And that's another way for us to get some mortal wounds is with Curse. And in Seraphon, you can usually get that Curse going off on a 3-up if you're near terrain on your side of the board. So just a fantastic vehicle to use that Curse prayer onto the enemy. And also, it has a unique ability where if you can roll 3 6s, you win the game. Basically, it'll double all your attacks within 24 inches of this model. When it goes off, I've only had it happen once in the last year or so. It is an amazing feeling. So tier 1 top unit, definitely an Engine of the Gods. I'm also including the Slaane's Star Master in the tier 1. Now, why does the Slaane outplace the Lord Croak? And I think it's because it's so much cheaper and you're using it for a specific role. The Slaane in this role is 100% a support hero. It does have a little bit of ability to do damage with its board-wide mortal spell, and that's great. You can plink off those small heroes. You can get rid of, you can kind of start wearing down those units that you need. But the board-wide unbinds, the ability to take some command traits and artifacts, so you can get rerolls. You can get some interesting abilities on the Slaane, and it's only 265 points. So you can keep this Slaane out of harm's way. Unlike Croak, who you're going to have to try to kind of push forward, this Slaane will stay back and support the rest of your army. Get you command points, cast spells, and really throw a wrench in the plans of your enemy in their magic phase. Stegadon on Skink Chief is another top unit we have. It's our best melee hero. It has the ability to put out a ton of damage. It does require a lot of buffs, but this unit can really slap when it gets in. It also has a good shooting ability, it's the same shooting ability as the other Stegadons, and so that can really help soften up the enemy, remove some screens before you charge this in. That Stegadon on Skink Chief has some incredible abilities to get into damage and fight, and it takes a lot of buffs onto it as well, since it does have that skink keyword. And so you can layer a bunch of buffs onto it and use it as a strategic piece to destroy what you need it to. The Skink Priest is another top unit. This is kind of the opposite of the last Skink unit we looked at. The Skink Priest is incredibly cheap, incredibly fragile, but has lots of utilities. It does have a prayer because it's a priest, and so you're taking one of the generic prayers from the GHB, since we don't have our own prayer lore. And it still has an ability that gives you a +1 to save, run, shoot, and charge. And so it's just an awesome piece. It also has a command ability with +1 to hit until your next hero phase. And that's important because that is unique from the all-out attack. And so you can use this one you can use his command ability on one unit and all-out attack on another unit. And just incredible piece to support your army, but very cheap and very fragile. You'll see this Skink Priest hidden a lot in the Realm Shipper engine. Great place for it, so it can pop off not only its abilities, but the Realm Shipper's abilities too. Another top unit in Tier 1 is a Skink Star Priest. Buffs stack on basically all Seraphon. It does have a unique staff that it just points at a friendly Seraphon unit, and it adds mortal wounds on 6s to wound. And so you'll see this being applied a lot to units that have a ton of attacks. That's really where you want to use it on, because you do have to get past that hit roll before you can get to the mortal wounds. But Skink Star Priests are in just about every list because its abilities are so useful. That Venom Staff it has, but then it also has Hand of Glory. It gets access to Hand of Glory, which will let you reroll hit rolls of 1. GW has removed most of those rerolls, so the ability to reroll the hit rolls of 1 is just fantastic in this army, especially when you have lots of high number of attacks but not good quality. It does tend to be a priority target for the enemy, so hide that guy in the Realm Shaper engine or behind it if needed. My last Tier 1 top unit would be the Bastiladon with Solar Engine. The damage output isn't huge, but it is consistent. You're rolling quite a few dice. You're rolling 9 attacks per activation, and it takes lots of buffs. So since it has a skink keyword, there are lots of abilities to buff up those attacks. And so you can get those attacks, which are already 2 damage, to hit and wound on better rolls. And that's important because you can double fire these Bastiladons in Thunder Lizards. So you'll see them a lot in Thunder Lizards, usually either 1 or 2, but you'll also see them in the other factions as well. It's a monster, it shoots, and it's incredibly tough. It still has that 1-up save. Now in Age of Sigmar 3, it will take Ren like normal, but that 1-up save is still really hard to get through. And so it offers the same kind of utility as like the Battle Line Stegodon, in that you'll be able to score a lot of battle tactics with it because it's a monster and because it's kind of sitting back in safety and shooting over the tops of all your screens. So a great piece for any army. You'll see it a lot in Thunder Lizards, but it'll show up in just about any list. And I made a special tier here, tier S, for Salamander, tier Salamander. The Salamander Honey Pack is probably what you have heard most about in Seraphon. In this edition, it is an interesting unit. It is a terrible model. It's a horrible old fine cast model. If you've ever put one of these together, it's not a good model to put together or paint. Pretty goofy looking. Definitely needs an update. But it plays extremely well on the table. It's our best source of rend because it does have -2 rend on its shooting and its melee, and that's our only -2 rend in the entire book. And so Salamanders have a big role right now with all of the high saves that units have in Age of Sigmar 3 and the ways that they can stack saves on top of that. So that high rend and mortal wound output is desperately needed in our army. And the Salamanders are that source of it. They can do mortal wounds when they shoot, and they can do mortal wounds when they fight. It's not a lot of attacks. It's only 4 attacks in shooting and in melee. But if you roll those 6s, you'll be glad for it because it can do some great mortal wounds. And it's our most consistent, our most reliable source of mortal wounds that we can deliver anywhere. It's also got some fun tech with the handlers. Because the handlers count as part of this unit, you basically have 3 wounds per salamander that you get to remove first before you do any damage. And that means if you're taking a unit of 2 salamanders and 6 handlers, you've got some extra wounds before you actually start getting down to the meat of the unit. And then if you try to rally it, if you've killed off, if any salamanders have died, you're getting extra dice to rally onto that extra salamander to bring it back. And so some really fun tech that you can use in Age of Sigmar 3 with these salamanders. They also do have the skink keywords, so you can buff them sky high with all of our support heroes. So GW still had some trouble pointing the salamanders. Every time we get an FAQ, the salamanders go up. And so we'll see how much higher they go up until they're no longer playable. I think already you're starting to kind of see the salamanders are getting outpaced with some of the other damage from the new books that are coming out. But as it is right now, they're still our best source of mortal wounds and rend. So get them on the table when you can and how you can. Just, can we please get an updated model for these? All right, that's it for my tier list. Let me know what you think is different. How would your tier list look? What's your top units and what's your trash units? Let me know in the comments below, and we'll catch you guys next time.